stacked up is basically. So that's something from there. So last week, I'm going to do a quick review of 2 items from last week because last week we introduced this idea of spiritual growth. Well, not introduced it completely, but we talked about it. And, the topic is, you can go so deep in the area of spiritual growth. And so I thought, well, let's just do a quick review. I'll try to add a couple things to help when we think about spiritual growth. What are we actually talking about? And then some cool things from the Bible that helps explain the idea of obedience. So spiritual growth the default is it always happens in something that we might call the crucible. Now, the crucible just means, it's like you're being forged in the fire. I love those Marine Corps commercials, partly because I was in the Marines, but I love those Marine Corps commercials where they're forging a sword in the fire because, the way you shape character in the Marine Corps is you send someone to boot camp. And boot camp is no rose garden. It has to be difficult, or else there's no transformation that happens. So transformation always happens in difficulty. So when we hit difficulty, we have to look for the gift. Just like in Deuteronomy, it says, God says through Moses, I will give them honey in the rock. And when you think about it, you think, well, wait a minute, the honey is inside of a rock? I got to go through the rock to get the honey? Yep, that's how God created us. So when we get to those difficulties in life, look for the gift. That was the main idea from last week. The goal of spiritual growth, we shape our spirit to be more and more in tune with God. So it's spiritual attunement. We want to be able to hear God more clearly. And when we can, you begin to hear God in ways that you'd never imagined. I know all of you have experienced that in some way, shape, or form where God shows up and you think, wow, that was just so cool. I never would have seen that coming. So you want to be able to constantly search for ways to attune your spirit. Now, I showed you this kind of diagram, and models are always flawed because spiritual growth especially is not static. But spiritual growth tends to move in a certain direction, and there's markers along the way that you can just kind of see through listening to people as they've gone through spiritual growth. So, generally we all start somewhere along the line. We don't have an awareness of God. You move from that awareness to a recognition of God, and there's a sense of awe that goes along with that. You then start doing church stuff. It's ritual, it's structure. You begin to put boundaries around your religion to say, how do I learn about God in a structured way? And then eventually we move into this point of serving God. Where just going through the motions isn't enough. We want to get to the point where we can start serving God. And all of these are kind of what we see in church in general, right? So you go to a Lutheran church and they have their rituals, and you go to a Baptist church and they have their rituals, and you go to Eastern Orthodox and they have their rituals. And of course, you can also see this is where we disagree with each other because we focus on the externals, but this is where it's generally happening. But there's tremendous growth in that. For anybody who's gone from not being a Christian to a Christian, there's tremendous growth in learning all of that and shaping and understanding all of that ritual and structure and everything about serving God. At some point, though, you move to a point where God becomes a little bit more dynamic. You have to relearn and you let go of some externals. The idea is releasing all things in life to God, and the goal is that you join in union with God. And all of this happens internally. You kind of have 2 sides to a coin, and what happens between number 4 and 5 is people often bump into number 5 and get a little nervous because it challenges maybe something they learned at a lower stage. Anyways, the whole point that I talked last week was that we want to strive to be in union with God, at least spiritually, and find peace. The problem is it's a difficult journey. It's marked by suffering. So often we're thrust into a situation in life where we suddenly have to release everything to God because we have nothing left. God That's the image in the Bible of the desert. God pulls Israel out of Egypt, and he doesn't take them to a nice, comfortable spot. He takes them into the desert where everything in life is stripped away. It all becomes about the struggle. But through the struggle, they learn to rely on God. So spiritual growth, by definition, is a struggle. You have to move through that struggle process, and you look for the gift inside the struggle. Okay, why is it a struggle? This is one of the fundamental questions. Why do we have to retool our way of we think about suffering? Well, we've looked at this picture before. You guys have all seen this. We have God and we have man. And of course, there's a huge dividing line between God and man. And one of the biggest differences between God and man is God is unlimited. He has zero limitations. We can't even fathom what zero limitation means. It just doesn't even make sense to us because we have all kinds of limitations. We have limitations in knowledge. We have limitations in our body. We get sick. We suffer. You have limitations on life. So as human beings who are limited, we're always struggling against bumping up against a limitation. And so what we have to learn to do is at the moment you hit that limitation, you then turn it over to God. Human beings are defined by limitations. That's just how God made us. If we were to take away any limitation, then you cease to be a human being. And so it's something we have to accept. So if we did a little logic, and this is what I put on your sheet, is fundamentally being, meaning your being in the world. The fact that we exist in the world is marked by limitation. So being equals limitation. God created all of us, but he created us limited. We struggle against him as the unlimited. Well, limitations is where we find suffering, because the moment you bump up against the limitation, right? So COVID-19 is a great example because it forces us to bump up against the limitation of knowing the future. Like I have a terrible, terrible predictor in my brain, right? I'm always thinking that things are going to turn out different than they are. So I have a terrible predictor. But God knows the future. So when I find myself in a moment of, say, anxiety over COVID-19, that's when I have to turn that over to God and say, God, I can't know the future, but you can. So it's a releasing. I release the future to God. And he says, thank you very much. That's exactly what I do. I'm everywhere. So limitation is where we get suffering. So you could make this kind of a logic statement. If being is limitation and limitation is suffering, then simply the fact that we're in the world is suffering. It's just the reality. And it doesn't mean suffering at the hands of evil. That's not my point. It's just that we all struggle in life. There isn't a human being in the world that doesn't struggle with something. And when we start to lose sight of that and we get angry at humanity itself, that's when people turn on other human beings as if they're the only ones suffering and other people aren't. So one of the great examples of Jesus in his humanity, I mean, think about God. God accepted the limitations of becoming a human. This is amazing. What an amazing God that he would come down to earth, willingly accept the limitations that are inherent in being, and then not turn on other human beings, right? So Jesus maintains love. He maintains goodness. He maintains the proper view of God, which then gets him through all kinds of rejection, betrayal, suffering, loss. People, he's constantly trying to tell people about the kingdom of God and they don't believe him and they reject him. It's an amazing picture that he's giving us, is that the path to peace is through the voluntary accepting of limitations, understanding that God is a much bigger place, right? That there's life goes on post this physical world. We'll see that today in Smyrna. And that in the face of human beings and all their frailties, don't turn to evil or don't turn to power, right? Jesus wants to show us forgiveness and love, and that's the path to peace. So it's really a powerful image when we can accept our own limitations, which is very difficult to do. Okay, so that's point one, is suffering is simply part of the journey. What are we trying to do? Why are we struggling then to move upward? Well, we want to hear God. And hearing God is where you can tune your spirit in a way to get closer to God, that you can live then more in peace in the world, because you see the world from God's vantage point rather than our physical vantage point. Now, there's a cool thing. I put this on your sheet last week and then didn't comment on it, and I apologize for that, because that always leaves us hanging with something. What I put on your sheet last week is the idea of hearing, and this comes from the Hebrew, the Old Testament. Hearing God. One of the things it's very strange about the Judaism. So Judaism, our Old Testament, it's a religion with 613 commandments, and yet it doesn't have any one single word that means obedience or to obey. It's a little bizarre that you would think if all he wants is rigid obedience, he would have created a word in Hebrew in his Bible that's specifically for obedience, but he doesn't. So we have the word in English, hear. That Hebrew word is shema. Deuteronomy 6:4, hear, O Israel. What's the greatest commandment? Jesus says, hear, O Israel, Shema Israel. Well, the word for obey, when you see English in your Old Testament about obey, the word shema, it's the same word. So obedience comes from the idea of hearing God. When we hear God clearly, then you act. And one of the things we have to really struggle against, because we live in a physical and we're limited, is we often reduce obedience to God to a list of rules, because they're easier for us to identify. Are you following the rules or not? When the idea of obedience is hearing God. So, people often ask the question, how did Abraham and Joseph and all of them, how did God see them as obedient when there was no law given yet? Well, it's because of this, because the word obey comes from hear. So Abraham heard God and walked. Therefore, he's obedient. That's how we would describe it. So my point is this. Hearing God or obedience to God is much more than simply following a list of rules. The rules are important, but they're not everything. And you can see as Jesus is debating with his kin, the Pharisees or the Sadducees or wherever, he's always trying to push them to see beyond simply the rules, where we start judging other people. Because we judge, even in our own physical selves, we judge other people based on rules. Hey, I didn't see you do this. Why do you do that? That doesn't make sense to me. And it's a lot of externals. And God tells us over and over, I judge a man's heart, not the external. So anyways, I just wanted to give you that idea of to hear God is literally to obey. So you want to strive to a point where you recognize God really wants us more hearing. And Jesus is obviously part of the Godhead. He can hear God clearly, but the image of him in his humanity is just like Adam at the beginning, when Adam and Eve walked in the garden and could hear God clearly. So part of our goal is to become Christ-like, like Jesus, and to hear God. So anyways, let me say this. If for some reason, we don't talk a lot about spiritual growth, if you have questions about it, if you want clarification about something, or you want me to help you with a book, or please let me know. Send me an email, or I don't want to leave you hanging if you think, now wait a minute, what did you mean by this? So please let me know if that's something that's calling out to you, like, wait, I want to know more about that. Okay, hopefully that helped. I just want to swing by it a second time. We learn in layers. So every time you swing by and watch a movie the second time, you see something you didn't see the first time. Okay, now this will all come into play with Smyrna, because part of the letter to Smyrna is suffering and don't give up, because there's more to this life. So don't give up in the face of suffering.